All right, Jim, our final question, and then we'll do something else real quick before we wrap things up. This was sent via the Cult of Cornette Facebook group by Nick the Bruiser, Debrewzer. Jim has said before that the Crusher was one of his childhood idols.
I don't know if I said idol. I'm not sure about that, but go ahead.
Jim has said before that the Crusher was one of his childhood idols. When would you have seen the Crusher?
Well, no, at Bruiser's TV.
Was he on Bruiser's TV a lot?
Yes, but not a lot, but it was like Roughhouse Fargo in Memphis. It was a big deal when Crusher came back. But even when Crusher wasn't there, Sam Mineker would drop in comments about, the great teams like Bruiser and Crusher. He was talked about, and they were paired up in all the magazines together, the pictures of Bruiser and Crusher. Even they were supposed to be cousins, even though they weren't, but because of their similar appearance and similar style. But they were a top 10 tag team in the business for years in the 60s. So even in the early 70s, when Crusher would come in, it'd be Bruiser and Crusher against the Valiant Brothers or Bruiser and Crusher against the Blackjacks. That was a big fucking deal.
Once again, Jim has said before the Crusher was one of his childhood idols. I am the current reigning champion of the Crusher impression segment from the Mr. Saloon contest at Crusher Fest in South Milwaukee. Those are all real things, by the way.
Well, yeah, because that's the thing. As big as Bruiser was in Indianapolis, the Crusher was, I think, even bigger maybe as a cultural icon in Milwaukee. And didn't he have a run of sellouts in the Milwaukee arena, like 6 years? Every show he was on sold out. They have a statue of him in the park. Even I did a show in Milwaukee for Dave Hero and oh God, who else was there? Well, it was a hockey game. This was 20 years ago. It was a hockey game, the Milwaukee Admirals, maybe. And then Jack Koshik and Dave Hero put on an autograph signing with wrestling legends. I was one of them, but the Crusher was there. And this was 2004, 2005, 2006, that era right there, right? And he was goddamn as over as anybody. More over, actually, than the rest of us. So the people there, Crusher was a big deal. Yes, I'm sorry, I'm droning on.
I would love it if Jim could say a few things about the Crusher. The first time he saw him, his impact on the business, how he was received in the Southern Territories, which I understand was quite different than the AWA, etc.
Well, the only time I can think that the Crusher worked a Southern Territory was he was working the late 70s. He made some shots in Atlanta.
In Georgia, in 79,
yeah.
Georgia, all of a sudden, the Crusher and Bobby Heenan were regulars.
Well, from Bobby, I don't know about the Crusher, but from Bobby, the deal was that Vern, especially in the summertime, he only ran 15 days a month. And he didn't run a lot of small spot shows like the other territories did because he was so big geographically in the Midwest. He only ran the bigger towns. And that's why Nick Bockwinkel told me he loved working there and never really left on a full-time basis because you had a quality of life. You were home a lot. The weather was cold, but you'd work 15, 17 days a month, and he could make on top $150,000 a year. And this was in the late 70s, early 80s. Bobby Heenan had told me that because of the schedule, he got an offer to go to Georgia. I think it was with Ole. And he moved down there and was thinking about staying because he liked the weather better. And, they had told him something like, oh, you can work here as long as you want. And then something happened that, 3 months later, 4 months later, we can't use you anymore, whatever. And he was glad he didn't move. But at that point, some of Vern's guys from the AWA started going down there and working Atlanta on a brief period. But as far as Crusher,
But I guess that's part of the issue. In Vern's territory, in Milwaukee, any of the stuff you would have seen for the Bruiser, you kind of got to see him grow from being the big, tough Reggie Lasowski, the Crusher, to an old man with a bowl cut.
yeah.
And then all of a sudden you just drop that into Georgia or anywhere else, it doesn't work the same way.
Well, yeah, and that's also the reason why that the schedule up there was easier for Jerry Jarrett to get Nick Bockwinkel as world champion because he wasn't working as often as the NWA champion. And Bockwinkel and Lawler had better matches anyway but nevertheless, that was the thing with Crusher. He was a notoriously bad worker and nice guy. And because of the gimmick, he and Bruiser were heels, but it was like a tag team of Steve Austin's. They beat everybody up and didn't sell anything until the people started liking them, and then they started working against other heels. And in the 60s, especially against a Japanese heel team or a German heel team or whatever, they were easy to pick as the baby faces. And Crusher had 20 years of TV and 20 years, like you said, in that territory where people saw it change gradually. But then all of a sudden you take a guy that's in his early 50s with a bowl haircut and talking like this and wanting to go to do the polka with the cuties and a beer barrel over and in Atlanta. And they're like, what the fuck's going on? And he was teamed up with Tommy Rich. So Crusher was over twice as old as Tommy Rich was at the time, but they were both blonde.
He's out there with his cigars.
Yeah. And because remember, Ole was from the AWA from Minnesota, and he'd seen the Crusher, but that's the thing is sometimes people overlook that for certain talents, you need the history. You need the history behind them that they had in that one territory they were over. They can't just go and replicate things the same way. But Crusher, great gimmick, great promo, tremendous box office draw. He and Bruiser were in the top 10 box office draws in the business as a team. Rotten worker, but it didn't matter in the day because of the gimmick.
All right. With all apologies to his friends and family for that comment at the end there.
Well, no, I think, and that's, I think he knew that. But it didn't matter because he made nothing but money. He drew, huge crowd. I mean, in the early 60s, he was working with Bruno in Pittsburgh in stadium shows. I mean, he was big in a variety of places. So the fact that he wasn't a dropkick artist, I don't think offended him too much. And when I saw him and he was almost 80 years old, I showed him a Wrestling Life magazine that I wanted him to autograph for me. And he glanced at it, not even time to see the date. And he said, that picture must have been 1954 or so, at 1954.